all the rest of the standard details, plus incorporating what transportation's recommended to finally get to where we are today.
Tom, did you have a question?
I did
earlier? I'm sorry.
about the driveway approach page. I was just
Number 12.
number, yeah, I guess that's, number 9.
Drawing 9.
Drawing 9. The question has to do with the 1 3/4 inch lip at the
Yes.
at the opening. Why is it that big?
It is that big to, as much as possible, retain the water in the curb line that's passing down through the
Okay.
section of the street.
Okay.
If you get much lower than that, and we are starting to see this in the ADA ramps now, you start to get ponding, and it tends to
Go
back
up
up
on
into
the
that
thing.
ramp.
That makes sense.
So on driveways, because it's not an ADA access, it's a tire
So when I'm
access,
on a-
you can be a little bit taller.
When I'm on a bike and I'm approaching, there's like, say, for example, the corner of D and Main Street, there's that gas station that just did the remodel.
The Cenex, yes.
If I turn right at a shallow angle, I'm hitting a really steep lip there. And so I have to actually kind of swing out into the street and then turn in. So I'm going out into traffic and then turning in because I want to hit perpendicular. If I don't, then I'm spilling across the sidewalk. So I thought maybe it was because somebody was going to come and raise the street later and put down another asphalt level or
At times,
layer
that
and
does happen,
Okay.
but that's not
So
the
it's
intent.
it's intended just to help with the water flow through
Deal with
there.
the drainage and
And
prevent the
those kinds
ponding.
of things.
Right. And part of what can happen, and again, we are starting to see this in the ADA ramps, because they require it flush through there, no lip
Right,
at all.
right,
Which is
exactly.
one of the changes.
Exactly.
But when you see our new ramp construction now, you'll start seeing more instances of puddling and ponding at the base of those ramps, and then it collects a little bit of mud, a little dirt, a little debris starts to build up. It gets icy sometimes in the winter. So that's one of the challenges with trying to go smaller or flush.
So these are going to be harder for somebody in a wheelchair.
Well, again, these are driveways.
It's a driveway, not a
So
ramp.
these are
Well,
not
right, but
intended for
people
wheelchair
sometimes
access.
have to use them.
So that
Given the
does-
situation.
That does happen.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
So, oh yes, the Transportation Commission spent quite a bit of time. In your packet is a summary document that was put together during that process, and I have added to that in the italics kind of the status report, if you will. I hope you've had a chance to look through that. Really what that is intended to do is to convey to the council some of the thoughts of the commission related to various components within the standard street drawings. There are some items in there that are not included in the street drawings because they require action other than the standard drawings. For instance, some of them talk about, things like limiting driveway access, limiting access from adjacent properties. Well, that is an access control management kind of process. That is not a standard construction drawing issue. So that's something we would take up separately. There are some items in there that are also really zoning-related questions that eventually would have to go through community development and P&Z and back to council. So there are some other processes that are suggested because of transportation's work that we'll want to look at in the future. Hopefully I've identified where those are clearly enough. The one item I did want to point out is that one of the recommendations of the Transportation Commission was that the local street be a 34-foot wide street. And in reviewing that with my staff and reviewing it with the fire marshal, the marshal and I both came to the recommendation that it should be a 36-foot wide street. The reason for that recommendation, 36. The reason for that recommendation is the 34-foot street with parking on both sides only leaves 18 feet of travel lane for two travel lanes, so 9 feet each lane. 18 feet in total. That's pretty narrow, and there's some benefit to that in the traffic calming, which is why transportation recommended it. But the fire access codes, under the International Fire Code adopted by the city, require at least 20 feet of travel lane. So if you've got two cars parked on either side of the roadway, you're down to 18 feet. It's a non-compliant section, if you will. So our recommendation that was presented to the Public Works Finance Committee was that we go to a 36-foot. That's what's in the packet that's before you this evening. They supported that. ask that we change it from the 34 originally shown to the 34 that's in here now.
The 36 is in there now.
36 is in here now, from 34 to 36. 36 in the package now. Okay. All right. Last two things. Late last week, we received a contact from one of the local engineers requesting that we consider a revision to the street standards. And it has to do with the question of property pins. And I'll just pick on one of these drawings real quick, something like this one, which is the Collector Street. And what you'll see on all but really one of these drawings on these cross-sections is that the sidewalk is shown as being placed with the rear of the sidewalk right at the property line, or the right-of-way line. Okay? And that's intentional in that we're trying to leave as much room out there as we can for planter strips, for planting trees, any potential future widening of the right-of-way, or excuse me, of the road section for either bike lanes or turn lanes or bus pullouts, things of that nature. But what it does is it puts the property corner for each of those lots adjacent to the street right at the back of the sidewalk. So setting a property pin becomes problematic because now you're right up against the back of the walk. And if anything's done to the walk, that pin gets disturbed, maybe removed, damaged, whichever. So the request that came in was that we consider moving those sidewalks 1/2 foot in off of the property lines, which in all cases except for the 36-foot local, we can accommodate. And that way we would avoid that conflict between the concrete sidewalk and the property pins and any future damage. So staff would be supportive of making that revision if the council would like to include that in its consideration and decisions this evening.
So why couldn't you do it on the 36-foot street? I mean, you've got, I'm assuming we're trying to get at least 50-foot of right-of-way in residential areas?
Here's why. This is the 36-foot local street, and I realize it's a little hard to see for those in the audience, but what we have is a 60-foot right-of-way.
Okay.
We have the 36-foot street section with half-foot curbs on both sides, so I think you should have 37 feet. We're maintaining a minimum 8-foot planter strip, which was considered the minimum for our street tree program.
Okay, so that's your
5-foot walk.
Yeah.
That gets us to a total of 63 feet. So in this situation, we also have easements to the outside of the 60-foot right-of-way to accommodate the last 1.5 of sidewalk.
Okay.
And so moving it 1/2 foot is not going to help us in that
It
situation.
was the tree lawn is the hang-up then.
Yeah, and you know, in the tree lawn, we've maintained a minimum of 8 feet. We do allow for reductions to 5 feet in certain situations, as approved by the city engineer.
Terrain and
mainly
whatnot.
topography-driven, right? Or just some conflict that you just cannot deal with in some way. Maybe it's a building or something of that nature. But the intent of the Transportation Commission was really to support the ability to plant trees and do landscaping that's appropriate within the tree lawns.
Would it make sense to have a wider right-of-way?
Well, that would be one way to address it. You know, when we got to this before, we were using the 34, we had a 61-foot section, so it's like 1/2 foot either side out in there. Thought it was probably all right to stick with the easement approach for the sidewalk. Do we go to a 64-foot right-of-way, 65? We could. You know, we're also trying to be cognizant of the issue of how much land do we
Right.
take up for local streets that are typically through subdivisions, things of that nature. So, you know, trying to keep it contained as best we can.
One of the things you do run into, and Dan brought up a good point, but it's something you do run into, the bigger the size of the right-of-way you take, then the less room for lots and that type of thing, any kind of a subdivision. And those of us that have been on past planning and zoning run into that whenever we've seen, you know, developments come in front of us, and sometimes those developments come in front of the council because, you know, and we need to end up resolving it, but that sometimes does become an issue. Wayne?
I agree with just kind of what I was going to say, Bill, too, or along to that particular thought is we have a developer, and the developer has 50 acres that they decided they want to try to put into residential, the more we require in right-of-way, and the more developing that we require them to do as far as streets and sidewalks and curbs and green spaces, the less profit there is for the developer.
Sure.
And I'm just kind of curious as to these changes that we're doing, and I don't imagine anybody sat down with a pencil and figured out what's the percentage of increase in cost to a developer to do this. But I think we start looking at an area where, these are nice and it's great to have these things if we're going to have cars and we're going to have bicycles, and which we are. But there's got to be a point finally to where we have to think about the developer also and his costs, and what's going to be happening to them? What's his bottom line, and how's that going to be affected?
Yeah, really, the items that are included for the level of improvement really are not, significantly different than our current standards. We're still requiring a street section, curb gutter, sidewalk on both sides, space for trees, utilities that go underneath. Where the changes really are in going to a local street as the standard, the 36-foot, with a 60-foot right-of-way. In some situations before, you saw a 50-foot right-of-way with a 28-foot wide street. Okay, so there is one change in land dedication, if you will, there. The actual street sections themselves, other than from a 34 to a 36-foot, so 2 feet of asphalt, and I guess the sidewalk width from 4 to 5 feet, those are really the changes in the actual infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So, it's pretty consistent with what we've been doing for quite a while, and really what all other agencies out there are requiring anymore.
One more question.
Okay, Wayne, continue.
36th Street, is that considered a collector street?
36-foot is a local street, all right, in this particular detail 1A, which accommodates the 20-foot of travel lanes and parking on both sides.
On each side.
Okay, to get to 36. And then the collector is actually also, well, it's actually a 34-foot street, but it does not include parking.
On either side.
On either side. So it is two 12-foot lanes, because on a collector, a little bit higher speed, definitely higher volume, so you need a little bit wider lane. Instead of 10, you go to 12. And then it has bike lanes.
Where I was going to go with this particular question was, if a developer decides when he's going to do his preliminary plat and his neighborhood streets, he decides, is it his option to have parking only on one side and have a narrower street, therefore a narrower right-of-way?
If he would like to do, well, it depends on the class of the street.
A what?
Okay, the classification of the street, right? If he's doing a local street section, it'll be 36 feet, 60-foot right-of-way, parking on both sides. That becomes the standard local street in the city of Moscow. Okay, parking on both sides and 20 feet of travel lanes. Okay, two 10-foot lanes, 60-foot right-of-way. The only way to vary from that would be a variance through the council, or in a few select situations, we would allow what we're calling the alternate local street, which is this 28-foot wide standard 1B. Now, this is similar to the one we have today. We have a 28-foot standard today, but its use here would be limited to cul-de-sacs or streets that are really only going to be extendable for 1 or 2 blocks. We're trying to avoid that situation where you end up with a very narrow street that becomes a through street serving multiple subdivisions, all right? Because we've seen that in town, and it's a bit problematic. So we do still have a 28-foot street standard. It is using a 60-foot right-of-way still, compared, similar to the regular local, but it is a little bit narrower street with parking on one side. Parking on one side. Now, if you are in an area that has a collector passing through from our street classifications map, then you would have to build to a collector standard, which is a 70-foot right-of-way, but the street section without turn lanes is 34 feet with bike lanes.
Parking. And no parking.
And no parking. Now, if there's a desire to add parking or to require parking, similar to what we saw just a couple of weeks ago, that's where this detail comes into effect, which is that collector parking option. So what you see here is the normal collector width, 34 feet, two 12-foot lanes, the bike lanes on both sides, and then these, what I call pods, that extend out and then drop back in, where we would have on-street parking available, either one side or both sides, depending on the situation and the desire of the council and the developer.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
And the last thing is, you have a resolution in your packet this evening, that it would be the process for adopting these, if the council so chooses. Would remind the council that if there's a desire to accommodate the one request that we were not able to capture in the drawings in the short time we had, to move those sidewalks in 1/2 foot, you would need to include that in your motion for adoption of the resolution.
Well, we asked Les a number of questions. Is there other questions for Les that the council would like to ask at this time?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir. Dan?
Then I would like to make a motion that we approve the revised standard construction drawings and the related resolution, including the survey pin modification that Les talked about for the property lines.
Okay, Dan made the motion.
I'll second.
And John made a second. Any discussion on it? We will start with Art.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, that resolution has passed with the 1/2 foot, as you described it, Les, for the pin markings. And this is resolution number 06. And I will read that real quick. Resolution number 2014-06, a resolution of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, adopting amended standard construction drawings relating to the construction of public streets and utilities within the city limits. Thank you, Les.